Alphonse Gabriel Capone, better known as Al, was born in Brooklyn, New York, on January 17, 1899. He was the fourth of 9 children in a family of Italian immigrants from Naples who had arrived in search of the American dream. His parents were an exemplary and hardworking family. His father, Gabriel, worked as a barber, and his mother, Teresina, was a seamstress. The rest of his siblings worked from a very young age in a multitude of jobs. Little Al was a good student who attended a Catholic school. Although he performed well academically, he also tended to skip classes, run away, and regularly got into fights with the other youngsters. One day, Al got into a fight in the schoolyard. A teacher showed up and tried to break up the fight, but that didn't sit well with young Capone, who responded by punching the teacher in the face, for which he was expelled from school at age 14. At that early age, he had to start working, first in a confectionery, then in a bowling alley, and finally in a factory. Very humble jobs that, evidently, had nothing to do with the great stories of crime, power, and money that the future would bring. Capone grew up in a difficult time when there were many immigrants in the United States, especially Italians, who were held in low esteem because they were thought to come to the country to engage in crime and break the law, and it was true that many gangsters of the time were of Italian origin, but the vast majority, like Capone's family, were just people who wanted to make an honest living. The Capone family lived in a lower-class Italian neighborhood, a ghetto where crime and violence were the order of the day, until they scraped together enough money to move to a safer neighborhood in northwest Brooklyn, specifically the Park Slope neighborhood. One of the main motivations of this family was to protect their children from the bad influences of the ghetto. However, this did not prevent the young man from becoming interested in the world of crime. Now, in a better neighborhood, he could compare himself to his neighbors and see that he was poorer and out of place. During his adolescence, Capone met Johnny Torrio, an Italian-American gangster who, seeing in the young man the makings of a crime kingpin, took him as his protege. Johnny Torrio, also known as Papa Joe, was an important man in the criminal underworld. He participated in dangerous gangs such as the Junior 40 Thieves or the 5 Points Gang, which you will surely know from Martin Scorsese's film Gangs of New York. Torrio was known for his diplomacy, but he was also a kind man who preferred to solve things through alliances and seeking a common good, although he was also perfectly capable of using violence and wiping off the map anyone who didn't want to do things the easy way, a strategy that Capone would imitate. He was a quick learner, as Capone is credited with phrases like, "Don't mistake my kindness for weakness. I am kind to everyone, but when someone is not kind to me, weakness is not what they will remember about me," or, "You can accomplish a lot more with a kind word and a gun than with one kind word." Al Capone, who was Johnny Torrio's protege, was gaining experience and notoriety among the New York Mafia, meeting such important characters as Salvatore Lucania, leader of the Geraci family, and Francesco Jorel, aka Frankie Jail, for whom he worked as a bodyguard. He did extortion work. He worked as a doorman in several of their brothels and as an extortionist of small businesses. In this period of his life, the young Capone, who would barely be 18 years old, earned one of the nicknames that would most define him for the rest of his life and that has inspired a multitude of films and narrative works: Scarface. The story goes that one night, while working in one of Frankie Yale's bars, a dive bar called the Harvard Inn, Capone got drunk and insulted one of the girls who worked there. Some versions, however, say that he did not insult her and that he only told her, a rather bold and risque comment. The point is that the girl was not a waitress, but the sister of Frank Galluccio, a gangster who was not amused by Capone's comment. Galluccio was furious and demanded that Capone apologize to the girl. Capone reportedly replied, "Take it easy, pal." Thus began a fight that ended with Galluccio making 3 cuts on Capone's left cheek. As a good wannabe gangster, Capone wanted revenge, but his boss, Frankie Galluccio, not only wouldn't let him, but also forced him to go apologize. Capone complied, and the amazing thing is that they later got along well, and, in the future, he would even hire Galluccio himself as one of his bodyguards. From then on, Capone was also known as Scarface. In 1918, Al Capone married Mary Josephine Hickey, a young Irish woman who a few weeks earlier had given birth to Albert Francis Capone, their first and only son. At the time, Al Capone was 19 years old and a notorious criminal on the streets of Brooklyn. Still, he was a son who deeply respected his parents and made himself respected. In 1919, Johnny Torrio asked him to accompany him to Chicago, which was under the control of Giacomo Colosimo, an Italian-American gangster better known as Big Jim Colosimo. Colosimo was into everything: racketeering, gambling, white slavery, prostitution. Johnny knew Colosimo because he was married to one of his aunts. When Colosimo's empire began to show signs of weakness, Johnny and Al joined his gang to use what they had learned in New York to bring order to the empire. That worked for a while, until Colosimo left Torrio's aunt for a younger woman and the Volstead Act went into effect. Known as the Prohibition Act, it prohibited the manufacture, consumption, and distribution of alcohol in most of the United States. In 1920, Torrio saw a great opportunity and told Colosimo he had to add bootlegging to his list of criminal activities. However, Colosimo refused. 5 months later, Colosimo was murdered. There were many suspects, among them the young Al Capone, although nothing could ever be proven. With Colosimo out of the equation, Johnny Torrio took control of the organization and seized the moment to make money from alcohol smuggling. The problem is that, with the arrival of smuggling, the organized crime business reached its peak, and so began the turf wars, bombings, and shootouts with modern Thompson submachine guns, which came to be called the Typewriters of Chicago, fighting against criminal organizations such as that of the Irish Dion Banyan, the O'Donnell brothers, or the Sicilian Gina. Torrio held on for about 5 years, until he almost died in a shootout with a rival gang, and decided he had had enough, so he went to Italy and left the business in the hands of his right-hand man. At only 26 years old, Al Capone became the undisputed boss of one of Chicago's most powerful criminal gangs and a fearsome rival for all his enemies, partly because he had already earned a reputation as Torrio's right-hand man, but mostly because of his violent and efficient way of operating. Scarface inherited an empire that had between 700 and 1,000 gunmen and dangerous thugs, in addition to a network that included illegal breweries and a transportation network that reached as far as Canada. This empire was called the Chicago Outfit or the South Side Gang. His rise to power started a war against all rival criminal gangs, which ended in every case in an undisputed victory for Scarface. The fact is that, in just 5 years, Al Capone became a media figure full of lights and shadows. During that period, the mobster spent millions of dollars bribing policemen, judges, lawyers, and politicians. In addition, Al Capone supplied alcohol to all these people, which gave him a certain immunity and good press. He considered himself more than a criminal and considered that, by smuggling alcohol, he was doing a kind of public work. He went so far as to say phrases like, "Public service is my motto. I'm just a businessman giving people what they want." During the Great Depression, after the crash of '29, he created the first soup kitchens where soup, coffee, donuts, and other foods were offered to the neediest people. In fact, it is known that he was in the habit of going to the soup kitchens to make sure that people received the help he was financing. These canteens provided 3 meals a day, with no second rations denied to anyone, no questions asked, and no one having to prove their need. An estimated 120,000 people benefited from these kitchens. In an interview, Al Capone is also credited with inventing the expiration date on food. Specifically, after one of his relatives, who was a nurse, became ill after drinking expired milk. This was apparently a strategic move into a legitimate business. Capone saw the potential profitability of the milk business. Chicago Outfit's control of the bottling facilities. Although it is unconfirmed that a relative of his got sick from expired milk, making it mandatory to list the expiration date on food improved his image. He also used to throw dollars out of his car window and tip as much as $50. Al Capone became so popular that Warner Brothers even offered him $200,000 to produce a movie in which he played himself, an offer he obviously turned down. In 1929, there were only two major criminal organizations in Chicago: Capone's South Side Gang and George Bax Moran's North Side Gang. The North Side Gang and the South Side Gang had been fighting for years since Johnny Torrio ordered the assassination of Johnny D. O'Brien, the former leader of the North Side Gang. Bax Moran replaced O'Brien and sought revenge for years, though without much success. In the end, Al Capone decided to take a swipe at the table and teach the Northsiders a lesson, a rather bloody lesson. On the night of February 14, 1929, 5 men drove up in a towering black 4-door Cadillac to an SMS Carthage Company garage on North Clark Street. In the garage where Bax Moran's men had received a tip that there was a shipment of alcohol from Al Capone's gang. However, that tip was a trap. Once inside, 4 men dressed as cops entered the warehouse and forced the 7 Northsiders to stand against the wall. The so-called cops hesitated, reloaded their Thompson submachine guns, and fired. To top it off, they fled. On that day, Bax Moran was supposed to be in the garage, but he was delayed and narrowly escaped. That bloody episode, which occurred almost 100 years ago, deeply marked the social memory of Chicago. So much so that State's Attorney George E.Q. Johnson, in charge of capturing Capone, described it at the time as the most gruesome crime in Chicago's appalling criminal history. The case was never closed, although both the media and the police assumed it was Al Capone's doing. There were witnesses who saw Jack Machine Gun McGurn, a trusted man of Capone's, among the hit men. Another hypothesis is that Capone had nothing to do with this case and that it was actually orchestrated by the police themselves. Police a few months later arrested Fred Killer Bark, a notorious bank robber, for removing his car near a Michigan police station. Bark had killed an officer and, although he managed to escape, the police found in his home an arsenal of weaponry that, after tests, turned out to be the same as that used in the Chicago Massacre. Currently, there are several sources that consider the possibility that none of the members of the South Side Gang were involved, and that everything had been prepared to damage Al Capone's public image. That same year, Capone, along with Johnny Torrio and other Italian and Jewish gangsters, founded the so-called National Crime Syndicate, a well-connected and organized confederation of criminal groups. Scarface would be involved in another of the most violent episodes of the black legend of crime of that decade. On May 8, 1929, the bodies of John Scalise, Albert Anselmi, and Joseph Ginta were found on a lonely road in Hammond, Indiana. Legend has it that these 3 had made a pact with Joe Aiello, another one of Capone's rivals, and had devised a plot to kill him. Scarface found out, and on May 7th, Aiello, Anselmi, and Ginta were killed. That day, he gathered 23 of his gang bosses in Bergham, a town in the neighboring state of Indiana, to participate in a business dinner away from Chicago. In the center of the table was a velvet box that aroused the curiosity of those present. Capone, accompanied by one of his mistresses, opened the box and shared with his lieutenants the 20 belts adorned with diamonds that formed the letter C. He handed them out one by one, and when he finished, Scalise, Anselmi, and Ginta were the only ones without a belt. Immediately afterwards, Capone, he ordered his goons to restrain them, pass them a baseball bat, and beat them to death. 1929 was the year in which Al Capone reached his maximum power and influence, but it was also the beginning of the end of his empire, because in 1929 Elliot Ness, an agent of the Prohibition Bureau, was assigned to Chicago with the objective of ending Al Capone's empire. Ness was a shy, reclusive man with a slight stuttering problem, and he was assigned to Chicago by Herbert Huber. He had promised to imprison Al Capone if he became president. And so he did. Elliot Ness had grown up in Chicago, and, although he was rejected by the FBI on more than 3 occasions, he accepted without hesitation the opportunity to take on Capone's criminal kingdom. The first thing Ness realized when he was assigned to Chicago was that everyone was bought, Everyone was corrupt, so he developed a plan to create a closed group of clean and unimpeachable investigators who would be in charge of sabotaging Capone's business, so that he would run out of money to continue bribing the police, judges, and lawyers he had on his payroll. This part of the plan seems a bit far-fetched, since the money Capone generated annually was stratospheric. More than $100 million. Although, according to National Geographic, he also spent some $125 million a year on bribes alone. The fact is that Ness was given carte blanche to operate in Chicago without supervision, being able to choose his team and with no obligation to answer to anyone, apart from George Q. Johnson, the Chicago prosecutor, and his assistant William Freck. Then the raids on Capone's distilleries and breweries began. It turned out that there was a big telephone operation. Thanks to that, Ness was getting information about the distilleries. In that period, Ness boasted of having uncovered breweries that generated over $1 million in profits. On one occasion, Eliot Ness called a press conference to report that he and the 12 men on his team had received bribe offers from Al Capone mobsters. These offers, of course, were rejected the next day. The newspapers ran the following headline: "Ness and his young agents have proved to Al Capone that they are incorruptible." The figure of Eliot Ness has also been mythologized by the cinema. Some sources say he was not so blameless, and they describe him as a womanizer. They also say that he invented many of the encounters between him and the mobster that he recounts in his book The Untouchables. In fact, according to Lawrence Bergren himself, author of the book Capone, The Man and the Times, Ness deliberately exaggerated many of the gangster's exploits. In any case, the appearance of the Untouchables began to cause problems for Capone. Eliot Ness suffered several assassination attempts, and one of his close friends was liquidated in 1929. The other capos, such as Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, Joe Masuria, and even his eternal rival, Bax Moran, made Al Capone see that his methods were endangering everyone's interests. The entire mafia proposed two things to him. First, that he make a truce with Bax Moran, and second, that he disappear from the public eye for a while. Al Capone accepted the proposal, and one day a policeman approached him and handed him his gun, a .38 revolver, and incriminated himself. The news appeared everywhere. Al Capone had been arrested for illegal possession of firearms and sentenced to 1 year in jail, a sentence that was reduced to 10 months for good behavior. The organization was left under the control of his brother Ralph "Bottle" Capone. The problem was that by the time he returned, things had gotten out of hand. Bax Moran had not respected the truce, and both the Ness group and the politicians were starting to corner him. Turned out that they already knew where to hit Al Capone. Taxes. In 1927, a law came into force by which the state obliged smugglers and mafia to declare the income obtained through their illicit activities and to pay the corresponding income tax. That strategy had served well enough against other mobsters, but with Al Capone it was more difficult, since his criminal network included businesses. A cover for laundering money. Then it was time for Frank J. Wilson, a Treasury Department investigator, to examine the more than 2 million documents and evidence from the raids on Al Capone's premises over the previous 6 years. Among this evidence, Wilson found some gambling-related receipts that read, "Frank paid $17,500 to Al, and based on these receipts, the case was built whereby Capone was linked to illegal gambling income and to the worst crime that can be committed in any country in the world, evading taxes." In 1930, Ralph Capone's brother was charged with tax evasion and spent more than 18 months in prison. On October 17, 1931, Capone was convicted of 5 counts of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in prison, plus a $50,000 fine. He was also required to pay back taxes of $215,000 plus interest. It should be noted that this conviction would not have been possible without the treachery of Edward Joseph O'Hara, a lawyer on Capone's staff who served as an undercover agent and whose collaboration was indispensable in deciphering Capone's accounting. He spent his early prison years in the Atlanta Penitentiary, from where he continued to run his criminal empire until Prohibition was repealed in 1933. His criminal operations did not disappear with Prohibition, as gambling, extortion, and prostitution remained important elements of his business. In August 1934, he was transferred to Alcatraz Federal Prison as prisoner number 85. The federal prison of Alcatraz was located on a rocky and sparsely vegetated island, located more than a mile off the coast of San Francisco, surrounded by the violent tide and cold water, which served as a barrier to any escape attempt. It was considered the strictest and most fearsome prison of all time. From Alcatraz, he was unable to sustain his criminal empire, much less receive the preferential treatment he had enjoyed in Atlanta, and he had to settle for being just another prisoner and working in the laundry. As did the other inmates, he entertained himself by playing the banjo and mandolin, and had to endure being referred to as Wop with the Mop by the young inmates. Unfortunately, Capone's torment would come for another reason. Years earlier, Al Capone had contracted syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease he would have contracted after his constant visits to brothels. The capo was never treated for syphilis because, although he was capable of murder without problems, he was terrified of injections. Once in prison, the disease spread and seriously worsened his condition. On November 26, 1939, after spending several years in the prison hospital and having earned merit for good behavior, Al Capone was released with obvious signs of syphilitic dementia. He was a man who rambled, had become unable to walk, and drooled upon his release from prison. The dreaded Scarface was barely a memory. Of the man who had gone in there, only the memory remained of someone who had at least retained enough sanity to order the liquidation of the traitor Edward O'Hara, who was shot during a car ride a week before Capone's release from prison. Once free, the old master of the lamp, already ruined and financially dependent on his brothers, secluded himself in his Miami Beach estate with his wife, son, and grandchildren. A family that he managed to keep away from the business, and that was by his side while he lived his last days. Having grown into a big boy, it is said that he had a mental age of 7 years and spent his time with his family, going to the movies and eating sweets and knickknacks. On January 25, 1947, he died at the age of 48 from a cerebral hemorrhage. He was buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery, west of Chicago, where his remains would forever rest next to those of his father and brother, hidden under a tombstone adorned with the phrase, "Jesus, have mercy."